let's play a video right off the bat before we bring in our next guest. Our next guest is with us. It's a treat to really talk to him because he's been covering this stuff for quite some time when it comes to the state of Israel. The way he covers it, I think it's so great. He gets you to open up your own mind, make your own decision. He just presents the evidence and lets you make the choice. He's not biased on it. But let's play this video real quick, and then we'll jump right into the situation. Jamie, this is the one with Piers Morgan.
How many civilians?
There we are.
You've killed.
We don't have exact figures, as you know. It's the fog of war.
But you've got exact numbers for Hamas terrorists you've killed. Why wouldn't you know how many civilians you've killed?
Because obviously our focus is to go after the Hamas terrorists. And
hang on, I mean, that does imply that you're putting a bigger premium on killing Hamas terrorists in terms of numbers and accountability than you are on innocent civilians. That can't be right, surely. If you know exactly how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, you must know how many civilians you've killed. Otherwise, you're prioritizing the lives of terrorists over innocent people.
Piers, with respect, don't put words into my mouth, please. I didn't say exactly 14,000. I said around 14,000. Whereas Hamas will come out with precise numbers that statisticians will look at.
Give me a ballpark number for civilians.
Well, you can use the ballpark as far as the Hamas figures, which I reject as being false.
Well, if they're false, why would you give me those?
I gave you the numbers that I had.
No, you've told me you know how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, but you don't seem to have any idea how many civilians you've killed. I'm just bemused. Why wouldn't you keep count of both?
I'm pausing just a sec. This goes on. You guys want to keep watching this because he actually keeps him on the air. I'm shocked to see this. Piers Morgan. Let him keep. This is amazing. He just keeps him on, and it just. Well,
before we play the rest of it, let's bring in our guest real quick, ladies and gentlemen. The last American vagabond, Ryan Christian, has joined us today to talk about this here. Ryan, you know, my question to you right off the bat was this ever about Hamas? You know what I'm saying? I've said this for quite some time. Those of us who've been paying attention to what's been going on, looking at the history, even going back to as far as 1948 and the first Nakba, we understood that it was never really about Hamas at the end of the day. In fact, Israel itself has always supported Hamas. Ron Paul talked about it on the floor of Congress. This is more about ethnic cleansing, in my mind, and genocide. But I want to get your thoughts, Ryan, before we play a little bit more of this intriguing video over here. I mean, things are so bad for the Zionist state that Piers Morgan, for crying out loud, is being a voice of reason. Ryan Christian, ladies and gentlemen, please, your opinions.
Well, first, thanks for having me on, guys. It's nice to meet you. Nice to see you again, Pasta. Nice to meet you, and thank you for inviting me on. Well, I think this is an important question, you know, but I think it's important to recognize that. I mean, just to make it really very simple, because as you well know, there's a lot to unpack. And if you're just talking about the whole broad history, that to talk about the origins of this versus what's going on today are two very different things. And just to make one simple point about that, as you highlighted briefly there, Pasta, is that we have verifiable information, both from Haaretz covering this, statements quoted directly from Netanyahu in his own Likud party meetings, former Prime Minister Barak on the record, all highlighting the fact that Israel has funded Hamas for the interest of making sure that they divided both Gaza and the West Bank so that they were always at odds. So ultimately, and that the PA over here on one side, Hamas on the other, so they could maintain the illusion that they wanted a two-state solution, but only because of Palestine and Hamas and so on that they couldn't get it. But the reality is they made sure by funding them in many other ways that they would never allow it. And so that's important to realize. So right there alone, you can recognize that you can't just simply say they're going after Hamas or Hamas is the only objective if you recognize that Israel has been using Hamas to achieve its own ends. And this has been called out by Israelis, by Israeli media. It's usually this disconnect between U.S. media, U.S. government, and what's openly said in Israel that's really the hard part for most Americans. But to go back to the origin of this, it's obvious to see that this was about exactly what you're highlighting. And this is, I mean, in fact, I'm going to be interviewing yet again Zach Foster, PhD, who has a history, a PhD in the history of Palestine from Princeton about this. And it's exactly his thoughts. And it's the verifiable history that this was about the ethnic cleansing of the area, the open statements by the origins of Zionism about what they were trying to accomplish, that they themselves called themselves their whole project settler colonialism. It's not some kind of buzzword. That's what they said about their own movement. And the idea that they even Ben Gurion even paid for a study. And there's a video, a documentary done about this, where he paid them to make it out to look like they left of their own accord. And this is because that wasn't the case, because there were some of the most grotesque things that we can talk about that happened there. Hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, you guys know the history. So I think it's important on that opening point to realize that Hamas is simply a tool that's being used. And it goes both ways in this, because I think since 2006 and forward, a lot has changed. And that's not even to get into whether I think the election itself should be taken at face value. But since then, and the new generations that grow up and have nowhere else to look have become part of this group. And I genuinely think there's a difference now of resistance versus what it really was in the beginning. And that the Qatar leadership that's still protected by Israel, in my opinion, is really the central point that they're controlling. That's what I would.
By the way, I just want to point out really quickly that I think I want to reiterate what you were talking about. Like, there was propaganda out there to make it look like the Palestinians just left. Yeah, like, we're going to go on a holiday for a little while. And this was taught in your Hebrew school, right? Which Hebrew school is essentially Zionist school, because I know this because I lived in Boca Raton and I still have a residency there. So I understand this. But it's really hard for me to imagine. It's hard for me to grasp why those same people who were considered to be anti-imperialist Jewish people, from New York, friends of mine, still just take the bait when it comes to Zionism, and they can't come full circle to realize the same way we were propagandized with our movies. Remember the Mujahideen we rooted for in Rambo 3 and against the Russians in Rocky 4. The same way we were propagandized with the movies and our culture, we were propagandized in our schools. And they can't grasp that, Matt. They can't get a hold of the fact that they've been played too, even on the Jewish front, on the Zionist front. Go ahead.
So this is the thing about the younger generation, because they're not watching as many movies. They're getting their information on social media. They're easy. It's easy for them to kind of funnel through all of the crap in the way, all of the different distractions, and it's as simple as it can be. Like, I'm going to quote one of my favorite people follow on Twitter. When we look at Caitlin Johnstone, she always sums this up. Like, I'm always seeing her feed, and Caitlin Johnstone will always say to us, "It's not that complicated. Once you get all the bullshit, little CNN headlines about 40 babies heads beheaded, all this crap. Once you get all that away, it's not that complicated. And anybody who doesn't want to look at it and see that for what it is stuck in a different mindset. So I don't even think this is about, they don't have the right information or they're confused. This is that they're in an actual mindset that prevents them from seeing something right in front of their face. And that's why I think we played that part of that clip up front, and we can play a little more in a second here. Yeah. But even when confronted and with no answer to the question, clearly you're not going after Hamas. Clearly you don't care about the civilians, or you could tell me how many civilians you're even killing. There's no answer to these easy questions. So clearly it's like, so the younger generation is seeing this. Am I right to think that, Ryan, that the younger generation is just not as gullible about this for some reason?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know if that's what I would pinpoint. I do agree, but you're right. The general sentiment, I agree that I think the younger generation is clearly the issue for this agenda. Even if you remember, even Greenblatt is on the record. Well, technically it was a leaked recording, but now on the record that he highlights this. And this is in regard to the TikTok ban, where he says it's not about a left or right issue, despite the entire apparatus screaming it's about a left-right issue while he was doing that. But the point being that he was saying it's a generational issue, and that the young kids, and he doesn't even state that this is somehow misinformation. He just said, like, it's a problem for us, that the TikTok dynamic is them sharing information that we don't want shared. And by the way, on a note within that, he even highlights that they have, as you know, a group that is fighting for a foreign nation's interest, that they have spies inside of Jewish organizations that are fighting against them, which is really unnerving. But you're right, though, and they really recognize that generational issue. And I think the bigger point is that this is something that they are having trouble controlling. It goes back to the bigger picture about what that video is discussing. I don't believe Piers Morgan I don't think he has good intentions. Let's put it that way.
No, definitely not.
But what
are his intentions then? If you had to guess.
Okay, okay, back to that point, then I think that Piers Morgan is, like I say about all of them, is aware, shockingly aware, that he is hemorrhaging following, because to that same point, the generation, the younger children, the younger generation, the kids and young adults are calling this out, and it's spreading like wildfire. The governments and people in positions of power, the media, are recognizing that they have interest with Israel, whatever the multifaceted interest that let's just take politicians, for example, are funded, influenced, they get in positions because of Israel support. And so they're going to, like usual, lie as much as they can to maintain that support. But now they're recognizing that nobody's buying it. And I think we all recognize that it's a vast majority of the world that's hauling this for what it is. And so now they're thinking, okay, well, hold on. I can either continue my blind support for Israel because historically that's all I've ever needed to do for the most part, and maybe I'll gain their support still, but I may lose my position. One, because I may not get votes if we still think that matters, or two, because other people, and this is the important part, other politicians are going to say, I see an opening right there. I'm going to stand up and pretend I care about the Palestinians, and I will gain all the support, maybe even sideways going, hey, Israel, I'm going to end up supporting you anyway, so support my campaign. That stuff happens. My point, though, is that then you got politicians that go, okay, I recognize that even though I'm going to lose Israel support, I have to start leaning away from this, like Biden suddenly going, maybe kill less children. And that still gets Israel hating on him, but he's still on Israel's side. Same thing with Piers Morgan. They're hemorrhaging support. They realize that they have to kind of throw some bones here and there, but usually while cementing other falsehoods within that conversation. That's the real big point, I think.
And I agree with you 100%, Ryan, on Piers Morgan's intentions are totally bad. But I want to watch a little bit more of this because just the fact that like it's happened, and it's really funny because he doesn't let the guy leave. He's like stuck. And it's just anybody who maybe happened to tune in, maybe the 10 people that still watch CNN, maybe 9 of them got a kick out of it. Let's watch a little more of this one.
I don't have that information to give you, Piers. If I did, I would.
You've literally no idea how many civilians you've been killing.
I can tell you definitively that our aim is to go after Hamas.
No, hang on. I'm sorry to push you on this. That's quite extraordinary. You're an official spokesman for the Israeli government, and you have no idea how many civilians you've killed. I thought you just told me that you were particularly careful about not killing civilians. But if you don't know how many you've killed, how can you say that with any certainty?
Because even if you were to go by a ratio of the Hamas figures, we would still be far ahead of any Western army. It wasn't my
question. You know it wasn't my question.
I don't have the information.
Well, you literally have no idea how many civilians you've killed.
It's not that I don't know. I'm not authorized to give the information. I don't have the information.
That's complete nonsense.
Wait, you're not authorized.
I don't understand.
Yeah, right. And he doesn't let him get away. It's hilarious. I thought this was maybe he was throwing us the phone, but it's
not that I don't have the number there, Ryan, Mr. Cristian. It's that we're not authorized to give you that number. I got it right here in my back pocket, but I can't.
It's a great number. It's the best number. It's the biggest number.
We're the most humane, compassionate army in the world, the IDF. And if you watch The Last American Vagabond for years, even before the Great Reset started, before COVID, before anything, if you watch The Last American Vagabond, you know that they're not the most compassionate, loving, careful IDF army in the world. They're one of the worst. They even have something called the Dahaya Doctrine. I believe, what's the other one they have? The Dahaya Doctrine allows them to what they're called mow the lawn. They have other operations they label too, Mr. Cristian, that are really bad. Please, the Hannibal Lecter.
The mowing the lawn is what, just so people understand that's the translation. This is what this really translates to, is just deciding to just occasionally and often for no reason just start killing a few people to make sure they understand what their place is. I mean, that's really what we're talking about. Hannibal Directive, I'm sure your audience is aware of, is the discussion of long story short, because of previous engagements, deciding that they'll kill their own people if taken hostage to avoid the dynamic of having to look bad by trying to give people for the exchange, which is what's happening right now. So that's why, and just in case your audience isn't aware, which I'm sure they probably are with your coverage, that this is a provable reality. Not only have colonels and other people high up in the IDF now admitted that this was a mass Hannibal, but that the directive is real, but that we have helicopter pilots, tank drivers, the head security of the kibbutz area. I mean, on and on and on, who have publicly said they watched IDF kill their own people, and the hostages that we know they keep killing or indiscriminately bombing, if you want to put it that way. So that's just incredibly alarming. But what I'd like to say about Pierce, which I think is important to what we were just saying before, it's what he's doing is not brave. It's a great point. And I'll talk about it on the show because it makes a clear point. But here's the thing I keep seeing. What he's doing is making something explicitly clear to those that have been blinded to it that's been self-evident for 6 months. Yep. Right. What he has been saying is obvious. It's the circular logic, if that's even the right term you would use. What he's saying is that, so we can compare it to this number. We don't have that number. But Pierce makes the point, which is obvious. Well, if you don't know, that means you're either lying about the number or you couldn't possibly know the other, because they're all happening simultaneously. So he's just lying. And I think the obvious reality is, I think they very well know that they've bombed indiscriminately. So they don't even know who they've killed. And quite frankly, I haven't seen, and this is the point I made the other day, a single example. Now, I find it impossible to believe they haven't killed a Hamas member, but a single example that we can see of a Hamas member of a human shield, none. And they keep throwing all these children at us, all these people. They go, oh, they were not, maybe they were human shields. And so you're telling me that we're supposed to take on credit that you killed all these Hamas members alongside those children, but we can't see the Hamas members, but here's all the children. Those are self-evident points.
Yeah. I did have this note that I think too as well. It's that it's because of us. Maybe I'd like to give us credit as citizen journalists or, independent media out there, that it's harder for the establishment to understand what the public is going to be favorable for or against. I think that the Biden administration, I think a lot of people in the Democratic Party thought that supporting Israel unequivocally was going to be the right move. It wasn't until we saw a lot of these protests and the people in the streets. And I think a lot of the Democrats were like, oh, remember George Floyd, the way we were able to exploit that? Let's jump on this train. Let's push harder and faster now for a ceasefire, where some of us out of the gate were like, whoa, this is going to get bad, and get bad very, very badly, just the way it did in Ukraine, Russia, the way Yanukovych was warning Putin and the Russian Federation, hey, man, you're going to have to jump in, and you're going to have to jump in really quickly. And a lot of us knew, like, okay, they're arming Nazis. They're arming the Azov battalion. This is the worst element of Western Ukraine. And if we don't do something and something's not done quickly, it's going to get out of hand. Sure enough, after 8 years, after working Minsk 1 and 2, 14,000 people in the Donbass, mostly ethnically speaking Russians, were bombed with U.S. weapons by the Azov battalion. We saw that right after October 7th. We understood right away that it's just going to be bad. We screamed about it. The Democrats, the Biden administration didn't. It wasn't until they were publicly pressured did they come out and say, wait a second, they're giving us the lip service that Piers Morgan is giving the lip service right here, right now.
So I don't think they saw it coming, because they had already successfully trained the Democratic voter to stay in line when it came to Trump crap, the 91 felonies. They trained the Democratic voter to stay in line when it came to Ukraine, even though you could clear as day see the billions of dollars going to democracy. That's what they told. That was the talking point. So what I saw is they were just, hey, let's just do the same blueprint again, and they should be okay. The students they're not going to get upset by this. They were, because we don't want Trump to win, and that was they thought they could take it. Just another one, another war, it's not even a war, just an annihilation of a people. And they thought that the people would stay in line because they were trained to do so. But
programs, right?
They were programmed, but something shifted. What was that thing that shifted?
Absolutely. Well, so what's really important that I see with the campus protests, I mean, and this is so fascinating. So you just highlighted, it's always the two-party illusion of either side is always struggling to work within the controlled zone. And I'm talking about the people that might otherwise be interested in other information, but they feel drawn to kind of like side with the paradigm. Like we keep seeing this, and it's obvious. We saw that with the beginning where you had the both sides really, but that were aggressively supporting Israel no matter what. And then right out of the gate, you saw a lot of the left side of the conversation recognize that there's a contradiction there in regard to what they pretend to support in the side of human rights and all of this. And so there's immediately that schism. Then on the right, you saw the same thing where it was okay. And of course, especially when you get the campus protests where you see this divide. Well, okay, well, we're supposed to be supporting free speech. We're supposed to be supporting our rights. And yet now we're attacking these kids because they've got pink hair and they wear a mask. And so you can see that these lines get drawn to force them into these positions. And I think what's so alarmingly obvious is that you have, especially on the right, of course, right now with the campus protests, is you've got Republicans who are fighting against or calling them, I mean, people like Ben Shapiro and David Rubin, who have been screaming about woke politics and censoring because of identity politics, are now literally censoring because of identity politics because of the people they don't agree with. And it's just, it's hypocrisy. But the interesting part about it is if you got the right who is struggling with this overlap because the Palestinians are predominantly conservative and were outwardly against the injections. But just because you've got this like central tool they jammed in there, I don't think that they, like the way it's framed, I should say, because I really am inspired by these campus protests, whatever their other political stances are, that they framed it as the left lunatics pro, COVID-19 or whatever vaccine. And so you got this reflexive response from the right to go, woke politics, we can't support that. And so, and then you get people like Michael Rappaport, who's probably one of the stupidest people on the internet, who comes out and compares it to January 6th. And I'm like, I don't know if this guy just realized what a bumbling move that was, or it was intentional. But you guys probably saw it. It caused this crazy divide where they're like, we support you. Oh, hold on, wait a minute, but I don't support that claim. And so now you've got this huge, I think this is what makes me feel that all of this was reactive, that Israel's actions and going immediately full genocide have caused the entire thing to fall apart. And now they're scrambling to try to make sense of everything and push us back into some control. I really think that's what's happening right now. But obviously they're taking advantage of everything they can within that. But I don't think they have control of this the way maybe many people think they do.
Ryan, how much more time do you have with us today?
I've got another, I have to have another interview in about half an hour. So I'd like to break off and at least at the most 15 minutes, if that's okay.
Oh yeah. Well, let me ask this question really quickly. It's not really a pivot. It's a little small. It's a small pivot. Are the Zionists the globalists that a lot of us talk about and warn the people about this global entity? Aren't they part of that same mechanism? Because so many of the populist right, who we were just talking about, who bought this whole we have to stop these pro-Hamas rallies, right? And we even know people out there that really try to compare once again the overplayed card by the populist right that the BLM riots, they weren't even a movement. It was so bad that they burnt half the town down. And I'm sure there was some stuff out there that was not really good. We saw in Wisconsin what led eventually to the whole Kyle Rittenhouse situation, because they allowed the police, certain businesses to burn down there. But it was overplayed, right? And they try to make the BLM protests like they were the worst riots in the world. And then it's just ridiculous. Now we see them trying to tie the Palestinian protest to the BLM protest, saying it's the same money involved. You hear George Soros and whatnot. However, it just drives me crazy because a lot of these populist right people who buy into that whole narrative and that rhetoric, they're the ones who often talked about the globalist entity. And that's what we have to watch about. The Steve Bannons, the Jack Posobics, all those network of people would say, it's about globalism. It's about the globalist, and trying to tie China into that. Are the Zionists the globalists that everybody's warned us about?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because at face value, I would say no, only because it seems like Zionists in particular seem so inwardly focused on their own agenda at the expense of everybody. So, I mean, you could argue that would eventually take the same framing as a globalist agenda if you allow them to take their agenda around the world. But I don't feel like they're like, I think that they're at odds almost with a lot of the other globalist ideas if it comes into contradiction with anything the Zionists believe is important. Otherwise, I think they support anything that achieves their agendas. Like, I think they're opportunists at the most obvious point. Like, for example, and I don't know if your audience is aware of this history, and it's not contentious. You can look this up on Wikipedia. I mean, it is contentious because they make it contentious, but the reality that the Lehi Party, that's a foundational element of Zionism, was aligning itself with Nazi Germany more than once, and did so, as Dan Cohen reports, and even Haaretz covers, past the final solution. So you can realize that these groups, and even the CIA, who I've covered, as a document you can still find right now on cia.gov, that says that the Zionists were willing to sacrifice the Arab Jews to get what they wanted. So it's not hard to piece that together and realize, okay, this is not really about what they claim it's about. It's about using anything to achieve their ends. And I think the same thing is the way it is today. So you can argue that they align on a lot of ways with that similar agenda. But I would argue, let's just take an example and say that the US or any other entities that we see as these globalist entities are trying to achieve that, suddenly decided that something that they wanted to do was challenging a tenet of what Zionism wanted. They would challenge all of it. That's just the way I would. But I honestly don't know. I think that the Zionist Israeli government is multifaceted even within that. Like, for instance, you have the parts of the extreme religious Zionism party, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and then you've got like Netanyahu, who is still wildly right and extreme, but he's less, if you will. And there's some on the other side of that, and they're vying for their own different agendas. But I do think that it's an interesting question because they often align. Like, for instance, with the COVID-19 conversation, the Great Reset, I see Israel as a central part of that, especially when the Pfizer and the world's lab and that conversation about what they did with the testing that Netanyahu openly acknowledged. So it's easy to see the overlap. Let's put it that way. But I think what's interesting is that you do have this odd focus coming from the people who want to make it about one thing versus the other and ignore certain overlaps. Like, for example, the Azov movement funding that came from Israel, as well as the United States. And even in 2018, Israeli human rights groups called them out and said, why are you funding neo-Nazis? And it's a public conversation, and so my point is that you can see that there's these overlaps to the agendas that don't really add up with the bigger picture. But, I think the interesting point about globalists is often misrepresented by people who want to use it for specific agendas and aim it at certain people that they want you to think are the problem. But we should question all of these people. I don't trust any of these governments, quite frankly.
We should question all of them. And at the same time, we should recognize some of our populist friends, some of our right-wing populist friends who aren't necessarily Zionists. They might be a little confused right now about what they're seeing. I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt that if we sat with them and said, listen, protesters always get smeared when they're doing something, when they're challenging power. I've started those conversations with a few people. It seems to be I'm planting a few seeds. I don't know how you guys are doing with those conversations, but I'm a little hopeful, just as long as they're not wired like a Zionist to start with. They're just generally confused because they heard this stuff, Pasta, you're talking about, the Black Lives Matter comparison. And I'm saying, step back real quick and look at how similar it is to January 6th, that you have people that are trying to actually use their First Amendment right to protest, got turned into domestic terrorists. So I start with that conversation, and I'm actually getting a little bit of ground with some folks. I don't know how you guys feel.
There's also a problem too, really quickly. Yeah, I'm going to let you jump in too, but I just want to just say this much too, and I'll hand it on over, Ryan. But there is something to, I think, a racist element where a lot of people on the populist right, they've heard this argument where they see the Palestinians as expendable, right? Like, why isn't anybody taking them in? What's going on? These people are so radical that they almost justify the fact that they're being ethnically cleansed. Go ahead, Ryan.
But see, I don't agree with the majority. I think right now what we're seeing is a desperate reframing, just like with COVID-19, that it's left, right, and it's divide. I think right now I see an overwhelming amount of conservatives who are calling this out because they can recognize a contradiction of your rights. I see an overwhelming amount of people on the left who are clearly protesting, and I think they're desperate to frame it that way, so we think that it's as it usually is. But to your point about like the Black Lives Matter and even January 6th, first to Black Lives Matter, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the same point we made then. And then Soros too. I wanted to comment on all the things you were saying there because these are important. Is that ultimately you can see that it was misrepresented, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't clear violence. And in fact, I think it's obvious that the media desperately avoided even acknowledging that the violence was taking place. So you can see where that contradiction or that how people could misinterpret that, because it's easy to read into that and think that it's all violent. And that's what the two-party illusion always presses, right? The extreme sides of the conversation where it's usually somewhere in the middle. But you can also show that there is funding that was going into these groups that were designed to make certain things happen. And I think that happens everywhere, as you were just highlighting, including in these campus protests. Now, to the point about the Soros money, let's be very clear about this, because it's really frustrating that we have people who present themselves as these objective journalists, but do flimsy and completely subjective work when it comes to things that are in the interest of their narrative and the paradigm. And that is the idea that what they can prove, and I've looked through this, is one element of funding that went up to 2021 from the Open Society Foundation to one of those groups. I think it was JVP, if I remember correctly. But the point was that that's not all the way to this day. And even then, but first and foremost, we should consider that. Does that mean that there's influence? Maybe. So think about that, right? But it's a fraction of what they're the funding that they're using right now. And there's multiple groups involved. So it's a really flimsy argument to just go George Soros and the CIA, which is what Alex Jones did. All of it brought to you by that, which maybe, but I kind of like things to be proven before I state large claims like that, And that's the problem, is that they then brush it all away as this one side. But it is part of it. I guarantee you, whether it's even about politics, there are corporate interests. There are every interest imaginable. This is what everybody's looking at. So there are people going, how can I use this to my benefit? How can I manipulate the outcome? But we need to realize, regardless of any of that, as I think you guys have discussed, that the protesters themselves, whether or not they know the history of all of Israel, Palestine, or even know what happened on October 7th, none of that disqualifies them from being able to recognize that murdering 15,000 children is a problem. And that's what it comes down to, is they can see it and they're calling it out. And then they try to make it about how they don't understand this or that. And they mire it in the two-party illusion. But again, I really think most people see through this.
I think they do. And I actually have to say, I'm just going to say the January 6th people that were on the right side of history saying you have the right to protest, I think we're closer to getting them to see that this is the same thing versus, and I'm going to say this, Leslie and I were sitting down with some Palestinian protesters at this vegan festival in Pasadena the other day. And we were talking about just the corruption and the media and all the spin. And then we just brought up COVID all of a sudden, just say, hey, and just like, hey, this is what they did with that too. And everyone, they were just like, no, we're done with the discussion. That was real. That was real. I'm like, guys. And I'm just like thinking, God, there's such a disconnect, but they got up and left. At least I'm saying the right-wing populists, at least they want to hear the conversation.
They're way more engaging.
That's
than the
what
left.
I'm thinking.
I think that's as well.
But
a little bit
changes.
Closer.
It changes based on the topic, though, right? Like you're right. And you get these reflexive, like, push your chair back, I'm out of here. Even though you guys were on the same page about how the government lies. It's like, how can you not at least apply that possible logic? But, it changes, whatever issue you're talking about, whether it's the wedge issues for either side. But to January 6th point, it's very important because obviously they were misrepresented. This was not an insurrection. Yes, there were crimes committed, but the fact that they have to lie so aggressively about everything. And let's not forget that we can prove that there was involvement of false flag level from Azov movement members, from people that were in Black Lives Matter adjacent groups, or Antifa, I guess is the actual one it was adjacent to, that were there and caught on video going, oh, we did it. We tricked them. It's like that didn't manage to make its way into the January 6th investigation. It's obvious there was more going on there. And I'm with you. I think most people are able to logically see that inconsistency unless they're so emotionally invested for one reason or another. COVID, for example, if let's just say they gave their child 6 shots and now all of a sudden they're grappling with what that truly means, they never want to admit it to themselves. See, that's what I see a lot.
That's the hard part. That was the whole, the most sinister part about COVID, right? The biggest sin, I think, was the fact that we couldn't have conversations, that we were censored, that even let some of these doctors become doctors. They really silenced them. I don't want to start mentioning them names, but we don't know who they are. They're mentioning people like us that, I was doing all my COVID coverage on Rockfin. I couldn't even speak a peep of it on YouTube, just like you, Ryan, too, as well. But while we're on the criticism of the left, right, and the fact that I think that Matt was 100% there, and I will agree that I think that more people from the populist right are willing to have these conversations without getting up and stomping off, unlike the left, where they really are more, they're more inclined to use cancel culture. Cancel that person, can't talk to him about that. He believes that that's a bioweapon. That's so untrue. He's going to cost lives, walk out. They also, the left has to work on their message at these protests too, as well. That's something that and they would learn so much if they had watched The Last American Vagabond from a long time ago on how to get a message across. They're trying to control the information so much that they only want certain people speaking to the press. Therefore, they're left, they're protesters, they're participants with masks on, not being able to engage. And that's really costing them a lot there. We've talked about different ways, whether they hang a picture of a woman or a child that's been bombed in Gaza, or have a pamphlet off to go over just to stay on message. That's something that's being missed. And it's also not the fact that it's just being missed. It's being misused. It's being taken and exploited. And the right's exploiting that whole, anti-COVID woke kind of culture and stamping it on the Palestinian protest.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, well, listen, let me just, because we had this conversation last week, Posse, because we were there. We went to the protest. That's what we did. We go to the story. We look for ourselves. We immerse ourselves into the environment and see what we see there. And I think we had this discussion about the approach. And yes, they could be a little more educated as far as how to engage with people with the pushback, have that language ready to go. I happen to think they did an excellent job. I still support their choice to be silent. I support that, because when you get into I'm telling you, when you're I was surrounded by 20 Zionists coming at me, you have to be sharp. You have to be skilled. You have to be calm, collected, you can't expect everybody to have all their talking points.
I get it, but they don't have to do that. They don't have to get into a circular talking point. They just have to go around. Well, listen, I'll let the organizers talk about that, but I'm here for this person, and hold up a picture of that woman or that child who was bombed. Stay on message. You got to also take advantage, and this is about organizing. You got to take advantage of these protests where you got so many ears and eyes there. You got to humanize what's going on. If we can humanize the children, the women and children who've been bombed in Gaza, which is the majority of them, and stay on that simple message, not get caught into a circular discussion, then we can accomplish so much more. I'm just saying it's a missed opportunity, and when you try to control the situation too much, it could backfire on you.
Yeah, I just disagree. I think that what they've done is the right move all the way around, and I think what they're doing. I mean, look, let's just say hypothetically they come out with this image and they say this, and I mean, I'll disagree with your logic. I mean, I think what you're saying, there should be some people should be making it more personal, but the bottom line is you're going to get somebody that's going to frame it and say, look at this person, Hamas killed this person, they don't understand. Like, it's about the misrepresentation, right, about what the media will do. So I've seen endless videos of people that are nailing it. Like, there was one that just made the rounds recently. I forget what channels came in on, but he just laid it out. Every single point, and surprisingly was on corporate media, but you don't see that very often. You get the ones where they take the rant, either it's a Zionist pretending to be somebody, which has already been proven to have happened countless times, or it's somebody on the outskirts that doesn't really know. They're just kind of there because they see it and they jump and, oh, give me your full story. And then they characterize that as what everybody thinks. Now, it's multifaceted. There are people there that have no idea. My point is the same, that if they choose to take part in a protest because they want to have solidarity, to frame that as wrong in any sense, I think is ridiculous. But I think the bottom line is they knew. And they took lessons from the 68 protest, from apartheid protest. They've talked about this. They took notes on how they resisted the misrepresentation, how they resisted the infiltration. And I think it's working for them. Now, I think the reason I think that what we're seeing is aggressive misrepresentation in the controlled media, that if we only look through that lens, we'll see it the way that they're framing it, or that this is what conservatives think versus this. I think it's the opposite. I think they're so desperate, like with COVID, to make us think that's where we are, that they're just lying. I mean, it's as simple as it is about everything that they can see. And all of these protesters, if you actually stand back and look at the bigger picture, are drawn attention to this to such a degree. I mean, realize Japan, Germany. There's like 6 other countries I've now seen where there's popping up of these campus protests. That's a success, guys. And I would think you agree, right? And so that's what this is really about. I think we should support this no matter what, regardless of I should never say no matter what, but in the context of them continuing what they're doing, regardless of the misrepresentations, as long as our main objective is to stop what's going on in Gaza, which is all they're really talking about, ceasefire. And we're going to continue to get misrepresentations to the very end. So I just think we need to stay on our ground and stay our course.
100%.
Final thoughts from him.
Yeah, I can't argue that. This is how we learn from our past. We draw historical references, what worked, what didn't. These kids, and I don't even want to call them kids, this young generation, the ones that are in the streets right now, they know what the hell they're doing. They're well organized, and they're not going to hit every punch, but overall, the movement is working, and we're seeing that absolutely. And we're going to play our role. Our role is to take the masks off. Our role is to have these conversations. And like I did that day at UCLA with Leslie, I stood outside of the barricades. I took on the Zionists. And you know what happened? The protesters that were in the barricade came up and they championed it. They were right there. They had their masks on, as was part of that was their instructions. And they were just allowing me, they were living vicariously through me and saying, oh, this guy can do the thing that we're going to play our role. He's going to do his thing. And everybody kind of finds their role. And I think that's what we're doing here on our shows, Homeless Left, Pasta to Go. We're finding our role in the larger scheme. And I think that all of the students out there, all the young people getting in the street, they're finding their role as well.
And that's Ryan Christian. He's got a role out there, and that's making sure he educates everybody out there on to question everything. He's been on for quite some time, been a mentor of sorts. I really love his work from the get-go. Ryan Christian, let everybody know what you're doing, where they can find you, where they can follow you, where they can support your work.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. I'm honored to be on, and I hope everyone out there continues to support their work, because they're doing good work out here. And thelastamericanvagabond.com is the place to go. That's where you'll find all of our work and ways to support the platform. So thank you guys. I mean, really appreciate what you're doing. And I think it's important that we have these, conversations that we especially if we disagree, so we can continue to have, come to something new, and I think what we're right now is new, and it is changing things, and it makes people uncomfortable. It doesn't mean we should support every single one of the people that are out there. I guarantee I disagree with most of them on a lot of things, but we all see a problem taking place, and that action right now is changing things. I don't know what else we've ever wanted, right? We're always talking about change. We're finally seeing it happening, and all we're seeing is the left and the right scream about how we shouldn't let it happen. I think that's what why people are waking up to it. So continue. So thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
He is Ryan Christian, the last American vagabond, one of the most censored men on the interwebs.
It's great meeting you, Ryan, and we'd love to have you on the Homeless Left with us again on our show. We'd love to keep the conversation going. Awesome.
Count on it.
Cool.
Have a good one, guys.
Peace out, brother.